Warhammer 40k Darktide and Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 are both great games that appear to cater to a similar audience. Both are co-op games based on the 40k setting that appear very similar on the surface, seemingly with the only exception being the camera's perspective, but that couldn't be further from the truth. These games are dramatically different experiences, and they both innovate on the co-op genre in their own unique ways. My goal as someone who has sunk thousands of hours into these games is to help you decide which of these two games is the better fit for you, and to do that, I'm going to compare both of the game's story, gameplay, and replayability. Let's jump right into the story of both of these games, and it's important to know that I won't be giving any spoilers for any of the narratives of these games. I'm just going to be talking about story delivery. And in Space Marine 2, the game delivers story in a very traditional way. The game features a campaign story mode with cutscenes, and it's not that difficult if you don't want it to be that difficult, which means that you could effectively experience the game's story like a movie if you really wanted to. The story of Space Marine 2 is a very conventional 40k story, and it plays out almost exactly like any other Space Marine novel. After you've finished the campaign, you can head over to the Operations PvE game mode, where you can experience the story from the perspective of other Ultramarines within the second company. Because the game has post-launch support, the game has also released new operations that actually continue the story of these Ultramarines. Additionally, the more that you play the game, the more that you can learn about the game in the game. As the data vault becomes accessible to you, the more ordeals or achievements that you complete. Switching over to Darktide, it's important to note that Darktide doesn't have a dedicated campaign mode. It has what's called the Battle for Tertium, which basically provides some backstory for all of the maps in the game. But just because the game doesn't have a campaign doesn't mean that it lacks a story. There's definitely a story there. The narrative is just delivered to you through the game's thousands of voice lines spoken by each of the player character personalities and the NPCs, through the martyr skulls that you find throughout the various missions and levels in the game, and through a hefty usage of environmental storytelling. This means that the story isn't immediately obvious to the player, and they have to go out of their way to learn the story. So the more invested you are in it, the more you're going to get out of it. When it comes to storytelling elements specifically, I actually prefer Darktide's way of delivering a narrative, because it kind of reminds me of Dark Souls. And speaking of Dark Souls, let's transition to talking about gameplay. And this may be a little controversial, but I think that Space Marine 2 can best be described as Dark Souls with guns. In Space Marine 2's combat system, timed parries and dodges are extremely important for creating openings. The game is much slower and more intentional than Darktide is. For example, there are attacks that will animation lock you and force a commitment out of you, so you have to be very tactical about what you do and when. Space Marine 2 also offers a very balanced sandbox in that there aren't any weapons that feel like you're pulling teeth to use even in the endgame. If you're skilled enough, then every class and weapon combination in Space Marine 2 can effectively solo every difficulty, including the endgame. Lastly, Space Marine 2 is a very accessible game, as you're able to play it by yourself if you really wanted to. In fact, you could actually disable the bots that the game matches you with if you ever wanted to do a true solo. And this means that you're able to pause the game if you need to. And to top it all off, I think that Space Marine 2 is the more accessible game when it comes to controllers. So if that's a make or break for you, if you're a controller player, then Space Marine 2 is definitely the easier game to get into. Transitioning over to Darktide, I've gone on record stating that this game has the best first-person melee combat system in the industry, specifically for PvE games alongside Vermintide 2. And in 2026, this still holds true. Darktide is the complete opposite of Space Marine 2 in that dodging, blocking, and pushing are definitely crucial for survival, but in Darktide, the best defense is a good offense. The game rewards you for quickly killing specialist enemies or for nuking bosses, because those bosses make such a tremendous impact on the battlefield that you just want to get rid of them as fast as possible. In Darktide, each enemy has an armor type, and the enemy variety definitely guides you to make different choices with your character's build, as each weapon is going to excel at dealing with different enemies, or each blitz or ability is going to excel at dealing with different enemies, so you really have to think about what your character is bringing to the table each match. Darktide is a much more complex game than Space Marine 2, thus it's much more difficult to master, and it certainly feels much more rewarding when you get better at the game. When it comes to gameplay elements specifically, I don't really have a preference between Space Marine 2 or Darktide. For me, the most important aspect of gameplay is that these games provide sufficient challenge, so skill expression feels rewarding and earned, and both of these games do a fantastic job of doing that, which is good, because if you get hooked on either of these games, then you're going to be playing them for a very long time. And this is because each game has tons of replayability, very in-depth progression systems, and all sorts of other ways to keep you logged in and engaged. In Space Marine 2, you've got several game modes that allow you to interact with the setting and with other players differently. The game has a campaign story mode, a PvE mode with operations, which are effectively just missions with a beginning and an end, a siege mode, which is a horde mode, and stratagems, which are the end game version of operations. They add modifiers to the operations. Additionally, it also has PvP. When it comes to progression, each game mode in Space Marine 2 has a ton of it. In PvE, you level up each of your classes and your weapons, and in endgame, you farm a currency in order to unlock heroic weapon variants. In PvP, the more you level up, the more guns you unlock for the various classes, and the better you get, the more PvP cosmetics you earn. And speaking of cosmetics, Space Marine 2 is a third-person game, so cosmetics are a big deal, and there is a shared progression between the PvE and PvP game modes where you could unlock different armor pieces for your Space Marine by completing PvE operations or by winning PvP matches. This means that in Space Marine 2, there's a lot of visual progression, as a lot of the cooler armor pieces in the game are locked behind challenges or hours and hours of gameplay. Additionally, as a game with post-launch support or a live service game, whatever you want to call it, all of the new content that doesn't exist to provide some kind of cosmetic benefit has been free so far. For example, the new Tech Marine class is going to be free for all players, and every new map that has been released for the game has been free for players. Darktide is also a live service game, but it's focused exclusively on PvE, so every update that it's received since launch has basically released more game modes, more maps, and released more systems to benefit the PvE sandbox exclusively. The game has several game modes to include the missions available on the mission board, which function almost identically to Left 4 Dead 2's missions in that you have a beginning, a couple of checkpoints, and an end of each mission, Mortis Trials, which act as the game's dedicated horde mode, and Havoc, which is the game's endgame game mode, and a harder version of the missions available in the base game. Just like Space Marine 2, progression in Darktide is tied to leveling up its classes, progressing weapons with the mastery system, which is effectively just leveling up your weapons, although Darktide does have some crafting elements and a deeper sense of intrinsic or skill progression, I would say. Whenever you progress to a higher difficulty in Darktide, it really feels like you earned it. Unfortunately, with the exception of some cosmetics that you could earn through the penance system or by completing the endgame game mode Havoc, most of Darktide's cosmetics are FOMO microtransactions, and each new class is DLC, meaning that you have to purchase each of them to play them. When it comes to all of the replayability elements specifically, I prefer the visual progression that Space Marine 2 introduces. I really like how anyone could tell that someone is a badass based on the gear that their character is wearing. With all that being said, there are a couple of preferences that are going to be a major make or break for a few of you. For example, camera perspective, controller feel, and the inclusion or lack thereof PvP. But if these things don't dictate the entire experience for you, then you should have enough information to decide if you want to play Space Marine 2, Darktide, both, or neither. Let me know in the comments which of these games you prefer and why. Don't go to war with each other in the comments section. Like and subscribe if you found any value in this video, and as always, this has been Jefficus, and I'll see you in-game. The Emperor protects.